There are moments in life that strip you down, raw and hollow. My heart was in that place, trying to mend itself after a rough breakup. The thing is, when you're hurting like that, there's this part of you that wants to confront something big, something outside yourself. So, I packed up my gear, my tent, and enough supplies for a few days and drove straight to the heart of the Rockies, hoping that nature's grandeur might bring some clarity. My destination? A less traveled route within a U.S. national park, and though I'd gone hiking before, I'd never gone alone. I reached the trailhead early, right as dawn smeared across the sky. The air was sharp, clean, and crisp with that piney freshness, and the forest itself seemed to be holding its breath. There weren't any other cars parked nearby, which, frankly, I liked. I didn't want to be around people. It was supposed to be a solo journey for self-discovery, a way to work through my feelings without distractions. Little did I know that solitude could be an invitation. After a few hours of hiking, I'd settled into a steady rhythm, the crunch of leaves underfoot and the soft rustling of the trees my only company. Around midday, I veered off the main trail, following a lesser-used path that hugged the side of a steep cliff face. I knew it was risky to stray from the known trail, but the drive to explore was intense, like I was meant to see something here. About a mile down the path, I noticed a dark shadow etched into the cliff above. At first, I thought it was just a deep overhang, but as I got closer, I realized it was a cave mouth, set about 30 feet up the rock face. I stood there, staring up at it, feeling a curious pull. It wasn't like I'd planned to do any spelunking, but I felt compelled to get a closer look. Maybe it was because the climb was challenging, and I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe it was something else entirely. So, after strapping my backpack tight, I began scaling the rocky face. My hands and feet found grips easily enough, and the adrenaline helped dull the fatigue in my muscles. When I finally reached the ledge outside the cave, I was panting but exhilarated. The view was breathtaking. Forest stretched out below in every direction, a sea of green interspersed with flashes of fiery autumn red and gold. Then I turned to the cave. The entrance was tall enough for me to walk upright, and the opening gaped like a mouth swallowing light. I pulled out my flashlight, clicking it on as I took a cautious step inside. The beam cast long shadows across the rocky walls, which were slick and glistening in patches, likely from some hidden vein of moisture deeper within. It was cold in there, colder than it had any right to be in early autumn, but I shrugged it off and took another step forward. That's when I heard it, a faint, buzzing hum, like a swarm of insects, only deeper, stranger. It seemed to be coming from somewhere within the cave. At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination, some trick of the acoustics. But when I called out a casual "Hello?" just to test the echo, the buzzing stopped dead. I froze, flashlight beam steady on the walls ahead, pulse racing. The silence was thicker than the cold air, pressing in around me. Suddenly, I wanted nothing more than to turn around and climb back down that cliff. But something in me, pride, curiosity, or plain old stupidity, made me take a few more steps forward. The further I went, the louder I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I held my flashlight steady, sweeping it back and forth across the cave walls. And that's when I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound. Breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable, the kind of deep, labored breath that comes from something huge. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife on the way up, and I doubted anything larger than a raccoon would make its home so far up a cliff face. But whatever was here now, it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded wrong, like someone forcing air through rotted lungs. In a flash of clarity, I realized I was not alone in this cave. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and leave, but my body betrayed me. I didn't want to alert, whatever it was. Moving as slowly as I could, I started to turn back toward the entrance, when my flashlight flickered, catching something in its dying beam. Two faces. They were thin and pale, so close to the wall they might have been painted onto it. Their skin had a sickly, bluish hue, stretched tight over sharp bones, their eyes hollow and unblinking, focused entirely on me. Every muscle in my body froze, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Those faces, they didn't look alive. They looked like they'd been dead for a long, long time. Yet they moved. The flicker of my flashlight's dying beam seemed to animate them, pulling them slowly away from the wall as if they were unpeeling themselves from it. In sheer panic, I fumbled to turn off the flashlight, plunging myself into total darkness, hoping they wouldn't follow if I couldn't see them. My hand was trembling as I pressed it to my mouth, trying to keep my breathing quiet. I backed up, step by agonizing step, praying they wouldn't hear me. But as I inched my way toward the entrance, something cold and solid wrapped around my ankle. I let out a choked scream and kicked, thrashing wildly, feeling my boot connect with something soft and yielding, but unmistakably real. There was a sound then, a hideous, guttural wail, like nothing I'd ever heard before, a sound that wasn't quite human but wasn't fully animal either. Fueled by pure terror, I broke into a desperate scramble. My hands clawed at the rock as I hauled myself toward the cave entrance, feeling that cold grip on my ankle slacken just enough for me to wrench free. With one last surge of adrenaline, I launched myself onto the ledge and didn't look back as I began my descent down the cliff face. Every part of me screamed to go faster, but the climb down required precision. My hands were sweating, slipping on the rocks, my heart pounding so loud I could hardly hear anything else. When I finally reached the ground, I sprinted away from the cliff, not stopping until I was far enough that the cave was no longer in sight. By the time I reached my car, my lungs were burning, and my hands were raw and bloody from the climb. I slammed the doors shut and sat there, staring back at the trailhead, still half expecting to see those faces emerging from the trees. Eventually, I did the only thing that made sense. I marked a large X in the dirt with a stick at the base of the cliff, a silent warning for anyone who might come after me. Then, as I drove back to civilization, my mind raced with 100 questions I couldn't answer, the worst of which was, what had I really seen in that cave? After a few miles, I called the local ranger station, trying my best to sound calm as I described the cave and gave them the coordinates. I made up some story about hearing suspicious noises, not wanting to mention the faces, the hands, the unnatural silence. They assured me they'd send someone to check it out. I don't know what, if anything, they found, but I do know this: I haven't been back to that park since, and I don't think I ever will. It was one of those nights, the kind that wraps around you like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The road stretched out dark and endless ahead of me, with only the faint glow of the headlights piercing the thick, ink-black air. I had stayed late at the office, and now it was well past midnight, my only companions being the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of a night breeze through the open window. As I drove down that lonely road back home, I saw him, a figure standing by the side of the road, his thumbs sticking out in the universal gesture of someone needing a lift. Normally, I would have thought twice about stopping for a stranger this late, but something about the night had softened me, made me feel an odd sense of vulnerability. I shook it off, slowing down until he was visible in the red glow of my brake lights. The man looked to be in his 40s, though the years hadn't been kind to him. His clothes were dark, blending into the night, and there was a ruggedness about him that spoke of someone who'd been on the road a long time. His eyes, though, they were sharp and focused, glittering slightly under the passing glow of my headlights. He gave me a nod as he approached, a hint of a grin tugging at his lips, and I motioned for him to hop in. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though an inexplicable chill had settled over me. His presence felt like something heavy and unyielding, as though the night itself had crawled into the passenger seat beside me. "Wherever you're going, friend," he replied, his voice soft but with an edge that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged, putting the car back in gear. "Guess you're in luck then. Got a bit of a drive ahead." At first, he didn't say much, and that suited me just fine. The occasional street lamp cast brief pools of light on his face, highlighting a scar that ran across his cheek, giving him an almost menacing appearance. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, trying to push down the unease that had begun to bubble up inside me. It was just a hitchhiker. Nothing more. "So you always drive alone at night?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was barely more than a murmur, but in the stillness of the car, it sounded as loud as a gunshot. "Yeah," I replied, glancing at him from the corner of my eye. "Keeps me from having to make small talk." He chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Small talk can be overrated. Silence is better, don't you think? Especially at night. There's something pure about the quiet, like the world holding its breath." His words hung in the air, heavy and cold, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. He was staring straight ahead, eyes fixed on the dark road in front of us. Something about the way he said it, like he reveled in the darkness, made my skin crawl. "Yeah, I guess," I replied, though I couldn't shake the feeling that he meant something more by it. Silence stretched between us again, thicker this time, almost oppressive. Out of the blue, he turned to me with an intense look. "You live alone, don't you?" I forced a laugh, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "What makes you think that?" "Just a hunch," he said, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "A lone wolf, aren't you?" "I can always tell." There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. Every instinct in my body was telling me to pull over, to end this ride and send him on his way. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. There was something hypnotic about him, something that held me in place, like a deer caught in headlights. He started talking again, his voice soft and almost wistful. "You know, most people don't understand the night. They're scared of it, try to fill it with noise and light. But the darkness, it's honest. It doesn't hide things the way daylight does." I didn't know how to respond to that. I kept my eyes on the road, hoping he would take the hint and drop the subject, but he kept going. "Do you know why I love the night?" he asked, leaning in slightly, his voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. "Because it's when people are at their most vulnerable. When they're alone, when they let their guard down. When they're exposed." My heart started to pound in my chest. I could feel the sweat beginning to collect on my forehead, and a cold dread settled over me. This wasn't just some random hitchhiker. There was something deeply wrong with this man. I glanced over at him, and that's when I noticed it, a glint of something metallic in his hand, partially hidden in his jacket. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked sharp, deadly. "Oh, I think this is where I need to stop," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "There's a gas station just up ahead. You can find another ride from there." He looked at me, his gaze piercing, as if he could see right through me. For a moment, I thought he was going to argue, but then he smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure," he replied, his voice smooth and easy, as if he hadn't just been talking about the darkness like it was his closest friend. I pulled into the gas station, my heart racing as I tried to keep my movements casual. "Just need to fill up," I muttered, getting out of the car. I glanced around, spotting a lone gas station attendant inside the small convenience store, looking bored and half asleep. I walked over, trying to steady my voice as I leaned in close. "Hey, can you call the cops? There's something off about that guy in my car." The attendant's eyes widened slightly, and he nodded, reaching for the phone. I glanced back at my car, where the hitchhiker was sitting motionless, staring straight ahead as if lost in his own world. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, a patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing in the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief as two officers stepped out, approaching my car cautiously. But when they opened the door, it was empty. The man was gone, vanished into the night like he had never been there. The officers looked at me with a mix of skepticism and concern as I tried to explain, my voice shaking. "He was there," I insisted, feeling the cold fingers of fear tighten around my heart. "He was right there. I saw him." One of the officers put a hand on my shoulder, giving me a sympathetic look. "You're probably just tired. Long night, a dark road, your mind can play tricks on you." But I knew what I had seen. I knew that man had been real, that he had sat beside me, talking about the darkness as if it was a friend, as if it had given him some sort of twisted power. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere in the night, waiting for his next ride, his next lone driver on a dark road. And sometimes, when I drive home late at night, I catch myself glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see those cold, piercing eyes staring back at me. My uncle, Richard, was the heart of our family, a man known for his boldness and sense of adventure. To us, he was invincible, someone who could conquer anything. But the man who came back from that mountain wasn't the same. I never understood what happened until much later. It started when Richard decided to attempt Everest again. He'd been up the mountain before, twice to be exact, but both times had to turn back before reaching the summit. He was stubborn, driven by a kind of fire that only a man like him could have. He had this gleam in his eye whenever he talked about Everest, something wild and free. "You can't understand it unless you stand at the top of the world," he would say, his grin wide and full of mystery. But this time, there was something different. Something in the way he spoke, as if the mountain had already begun to haunt him. His first expedition was a solo one. I thought nothing of it at first. Richard had always preferred to take on challenges by himself. When he set out, he was confident, even more so than in previous years. He was in his late 40s, but he had the energy of someone much younger. Everyone in the family thought he'd make it this time. We were all hopeful. We had no idea what awaited him up there. Days passed, then weeks, and as the wait dragged on, unease began to settle in. No messages, no updates, no signs of life. We were used to Richard's long silences during his expeditions, but this was different. After almost 3 weeks of radio silence, we began to grow worried. When the call finally came, it wasn't from him. It was from another climber who had crossed paths with Richard on his way down from the mountain. They told us that Richard had been found in a state of shock. He was alive, but barely. They'd brought him down to a base camp, and the first thing he said when he woke up was, "It wasn't real. It couldn't have been real." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I didn't know that those words would come to define the rest of his life. I made my way to the base camp, eager to see him, but when I finally laid eyes on Richard, he wasn't the man I remembered. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow with the kind of emptiness you only see in someone who's been to the edge of their own mind and back. His usual confident demeanor was gone. He sat in a corner, his hands shaking, muttering to himself about things I couldn't make sense of. Richard didn't talk much during the days after his return, and when he did, his words didn't make much sense. He spoke about the climb to the summit, but what stood out most was what he said about the death zone, a place above 8,000 meters on Everest where the air is so thin that even the strongest climbers can struggle to breathe. He told me that he had been there, in that zone, when the hallucinations started. "I wasn't alone," he said quietly, staring at the floor. "There was someone with me. A man, just waiting." He paused, his breath shallow. "And he was telling me to keep going. To reach the top." Richard's eyes darted around the room, as if he was seeing something I couldn't. The first time he saw the man was when he came across a body. At first, Richard thought it was just another frozen corpse, another climber who had succumbed to the mountain's merciless grasp. But then he saw the face, or what remained of it, and the eyes. Something about those eyes stopped him cold. He described it to me as though it was burned into his memory. "They weren't just eyes," he said. "They were watching me. Like they were still alive." Richard stood there, staring at the body for what felt like hours, the cold air biting into his skin, his mind slowly beginning to unravel. The further he climbed, the worse it got. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The oxygen was running low, and everything around him seemed to blur into a haze. The mountain was talking to him, whispering, pulling at his sanity. Then came the voice that had started as a faint echo and slowly grew louder as he reached the highest points of the climb. A voice he couldn't place. "It was calling me," he said, his voice cracking. "It was the man, the one I saw. He was telling me to keep going. He said I was almost there, that I could make it." Richard had no idea how long he'd been climbing when the man appeared. He had no memory of him arriving or where he'd come from. He just remembered looking up and seeing him standing there, the man in the distance, smiling in a way that was all wrong. A smile that didn't fit on a face frozen by the cold. "Come on," the man had said, his voice strangely light, almost mocking. "You can do this. Just keep going. We're almost there." Richard couldn't understand it. He felt the ground beneath his feet shift, and the darkness around him seemed to thicken, curling like a living thing. "Who are you?" he asked, but the man only smiled wider, tilting his head. And then the man spoke again, his voice strange, echoing in Richard's mind like it was coming from all around him, from the very rock beneath his boots. "You can join me," he said, grinning. "Just take one more step." Richard could feel the weight of the words, the pull, the eerie invitation. It felt wrong, too wrong. The further he pushed forward, the more the voice swelled, demanding that he keep climbing. He didn't know why he didn't turn back. Maybe it was the desperation, the exhaustion. Or maybe it was because, somewhere deep inside him, he wanted to believe that this was just another hallucination, that it was all in his mind. But then came the moment that changed everything, the moment when Richard realized he wasn't hallucinating. The man had smiled again, too wide, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And then, with a voice so calm it made Richard's blood run cold, he said, "Watch me jump." Before Richard could react, the man stepped back, just a little, and leaped. The silence that followed was worse than anything Richard had ever experienced. There was no crash, no sound of the man hitting the snow. Just an empty void where he had stood. Richard rushed to the edge, screaming, searching the snow for any trace of the man. But there was nothing. No body, no sign, no noise. He stumbled backward, his head spinning, his heart racing. He couldn't breathe. The air was too thin. Everything was starting to fade, the edges of his vision blurring. He felt the dizziness coming on strong and tried to turn back, but his legs wouldn't move. The man's voice echoed in his head again. "Just take one more step." Richard couldn't take it anymore. He turned and stumbled down the mountain as fast as he could, desperate to get away. The world spun around him, and the darkness grew deeper with every step. He collapsed, finally losing consciousness, and the next thing he knew, he was being carried down the mountain by other climbers, all of them speaking in urgent tones. He woke up in a medical tent, disoriented and covered in frostbite, his body shaking uncontrollably. They had given him oxygen and food, and his mind was slowly starting to clear. But something inside him had broken. Something had shifted. Weeks later, we got the news. The man Richard had seen on Everest, the one who had invited him to join him, had actually been a real person. A climber who had died just days before Richard had reached that part of the mountain. His name was Adam Foster. A young, eager climber who had perished in the same area Richard had been, the same place where he had seen the hallucination. It was enough to make anyone question reality. But Richard? He couldn't let it go. He couldn't stop wondering if that man had really been a ghost, or if it had just been a symptom of the altitude sickness. To this day, Richard never talks about Everest without a look of terror in his eyes. He never says it outright, but I know the truth. He's not sure what he saw. And he's scared of finding out. It was 2017, and Ally and I had just tied the knot at the Church of the Little Flower in Coral Gables, Florida. The church was stunning, with its high arched ceilings and stained glass windows that filtered the sunlight in a way that made everything feel surreal, like we were all part of something sacred. I had the usual wedding jitters, but I felt nothing but warmth in my heart when I looked over at Ally. She was radiant, absolutely glowing, and I couldn't believe I was lucky enough to call her my wife. But as soon as we left the church and made our way to the gardens for the photos, something started to feel off. You see, Ally's cousin Chelsea had always been a bit of an enigma in the family. There had been a time when she disappeared from the scene completely, leaving her family members to wonder if she was even alive anymore. Word on the street was that she had gotten into drugs, hard ones, and that her relationships with everyone around her had deteriorated. No one had heard from her in months before the wedding, and I honestly didn't think she would show up. But she did. She arrived with Rob, her new boyfriend, a man whose presence immediately felt strange. Rob was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a sharp, almost predatory look in his eyes. He wore a black leather jacket that seemed too dark for a wedding, and his scruffy beard added to the air of danger that clung to him like a bad scent. Chelsea, on the other hand, was noticeably thinner than when we had last seen her, and her eyes were hollow, as if she had seen too much of the world's darker side. There was an awkwardness to their interaction with the rest of the family, as if they were both trying to blend in, but the tension was palpable. While we were all standing around the church garden, preparing for group photos, Chelsea and Rob started talking in low voices. It was almost like they were speaking in code, whispering things that no one could quite make out. The way they looked at each other made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. After all, it was our special day, and I didn't want to let anything spoil the moment. But when we moved inside to the reception hall, that's when things took a turn for the worse. Rob, who had been quiet up until that point, approached me with a cocky smile. His words were casual, but there was something about the way he spoke that sent a chill down my spine. "Hey man," he said. "You sure you're ready for all this?" He motioned around the room with a sweeping gesture, as if he were the one hosting the event. "This whole thing, it's a lot of responsibility. You're sure you can handle it?" I didn't know how to respond. My mind was still on the vows I had just exchanged with Ally, on the life we were starting together. But Rob didn't give me time to answer. He just chuckled, gave me a pat on the back, too hard I thought, and then turned to walk away. As he did, I saw him glance over his shoulder at Chelsea, who was standing near the bar. I noticed that her eyes followed him, almost as if she were waiting for some kind of signal. I had no idea what to make of it. My thoughts quickly moved to the food and the music, trying to get back into the celebration. But then things got weird. It wasn't long after Rob's strange conversation with me that I realized he was no longer at the party. At first, I thought he might have just stepped outside to get some air or take a call, but as time passed and people continued to enjoy themselves, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Chelsea, for her part, seemed to be avoiding everyone else, sitting alone at a table, staring down at her drink with a distant expression on her face. Then, someone mentioned the gifts. The reception hall had a separate room where guests had placed their presents. It wasn't until someone went to check on the room that we realized a few of the gifts were missing, some cash, some high-end kitchen gadgets, and even a few gift cards had vanished. I couldn't believe it. Ally and I had worked so hard to make sure everything was perfect. We hadn't even opened the presents yet. Who would steal from a wedding? The suspicion immediately fell on Rob. No one had seen him leave, and he had been one of the last people to visit that room. But when we called the police, they told us there was nothing they could do. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and nothing of substantial value missing. It was frustrating, but what could we do? There was no solid evidence. That night, after the reception ended, Ally received a text message from Chelsea. It was short, just a request for our home address so she could drop off the gift that she'd forgotten to give us at the wedding. The message came from Chelsea's number, but something about it felt off. Why didn't she just give it to us at the reception like everyone else? Ally called her back, but when the phone picked up, all she could hear was the sound of breathing, slow, heavy, unsettling. She hung up, feeling a cold shiver crawl up her spine. She tried calling again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. Her heart pounded as she glanced over at me, the confusion written all over her face. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling. I agreed. I suggested she call her grandmother, who lived nearby. When Ally did, she learned that Chelsea had left the wedding early, and her grandmother confirmed that Chelsea had left her phone behind at the reception. Ally's face went pale. That meant that someone else had sent that message to us. And when we thought about it, it only made sense. Rob. He must have taken Chelsea's phone. It was then that we realized we were in real danger. Rob knew our address now. He had it, and he was most likely planning something we couldn't even begin to understand. We asked my father to stay at our house overnight, just to make sure everything was okay. But it wasn't. The next morning, we received a terrifying message from my dad. He said he had seen someone moving outside our house, jumping from one window to another in a way that felt threatening. He could hear someone breathing on the other side of the glass, but when he went outside, there was no one there. My dad was shaken, and we knew we had to call the police again. When we arrived at the station to speak with the officers about Rob, they once again told us there was nothing they could do. No evidence, they said. We can't investigate further without proof of a crime. But they didn't have to tell us that. We already knew. Over the next few days, things quieted down, but there was a lingering unease in the air. Ally was jumpy, and I could barely sleep, always feeling like someone was watching us. Then, just as suddenly as they had entered our lives, Chelsea and Rob vanished. They didn't show up at any family gatherings, and Chelsea stopped answering calls and texts. Word got around that they had gotten into a huge fight at the wedding, but no one knew for sure what happened. It was only months later, when Ally and I were talking to her aunt, that we learned the truth. Chelsea had told her aunt that Rob had accused her family of trying to sabotage him, trying to destroy his life for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. He was paranoid, volatile, and had gotten increasingly erratic. After a big argument between them, Chelsea had left him. But the damage had already been done. He knew too much, and I believe he was watching us, waiting for his moment. It was just another night. I had stayed late at work, as usual. The city was still buzzing when I stepped out, the neon lights reflecting off the damp streets, glistening like 1,000 eyes staring back at me. I wasn't in a rush. I never am, really. My apartment is only a few blocks away, just enough time for me to unwind and let my mind wander from the stresses of the day. A calm evening walk was exactly what I needed. I remember the air feeling thick, like the humidity had settled in for the night. It wasn't unbearable, but it was there, clinging to the back of my neck, making my shirt stick to my skin. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets, hunching my shoulders against the chill. The streets weren't exactly empty, but they were quiet, with only the occasional car passing by and the distant hum of a conversation floating from a nearby bar. The sort of night where you're left alone with your thoughts. I didn't think much of it when I first noticed the footsteps. It was faint, just the soft thud of shoes on pavement, but it caught my attention enough for me to glance over my shoulder. There was a figure trailing behind me, but it didn't strike me as odd. I'm sure I'd seen this person before, someone from the neighborhood maybe. After all, it was late, people were heading home, or out for a midnight stroll like me. I just shrugged it off and kept walking. But then the steps came again, almost perfectly in sync with mine. Left foot, right foot, and then, exactly the same rhythm again. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, but I kept my pace steady, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up inside me. I glanced back a second time, more deliberately this time. The figure hadn't changed its distance. They were still a few steps behind me, just far enough to stay out of clear sight. I could tell they were tall, maybe a little shorter than me, but the features were hidden by the shadow cast by a nearby streetlight. It was too dark to make out any defining details, but I could feel their eyes. I couldn't see them, but I felt them boring into me, following my every move. Something about it felt wrong. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the footsteps mirrored my every step. Every time I sped up, they did too. Every time I slowed down, they matched me. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. After all, maybe they were heading in the same direction. Maybe it was just a random person out for a walk too. But then came the change. They didn't pass me. They didn't veer off in another direction like I'd expected them to. They stayed right behind me, never getting closer but never falling farther behind either. I started to feel the tightness in my chest. My pulse quickened, and my mind began to race. Something wasn't right. I decided to test it. I changed direction. Just a little at first, turning onto a side street. I was hoping they would keep walking straight, but they didn't. They followed. They always followed. I felt a cold chill rush through me, a wave of panic that gripped my chest. No one had been walking this street earlier. I was sure of it. Why was this person still here, matching my every move? I could hear them clearly now, the soft thud of their footsteps on the cracked pavement, just a few steps behind me. My heart began to pound harder, a slow, steady thrum in my chest. I decided to make a more obvious change, to break into a faster pace, heading toward the alley where I usually cut through when I'm running late. Maybe I could lose them there. Maybe it was all just in my head. But the footsteps? They didn't falter. No matter how fast I went, they matched my pace, every footstep falling in time with mine, as if they knew exactly what I was going to do before I did. I turned to look again, my eyes wide, searching for any sign of the person following me. But all I saw was the shadowy outline of their form, looming just behind me. For the first time, I felt the weight of their presence like a physical thing. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, feeling me. And that's when I saw it. A flash of something. Was it a smile? In the darkness. A pale, stretched grin that didn't match the faint outline of their face, almost as though their mouth was too wide. It felt unnatural. A creeping sensation crawled up my spine. My skin went cold. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand on end. I couldn't tear my gaze away. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt heavy, like I was stuck in a nightmare where every movement was a slow-motion struggle. I couldn't let them get any closer. I had to act now. I didn't look back as I bolted, taking a sharp turn around a corner and sprinting down the street. My breath was ragged, my heart hammering against my ribcage. I heard them, too. The footsteps, never faltering, always just behind me. I didn't dare look back now. I couldn't risk it. I ran for what felt like forever, turning corners, weaving through the darkened streets, praying to whatever might be listening that I could get away. My apartment was just a few blocks away, and I knew if I could get there, I'd be safe. I finally made it, my legs burning from the effort, my breath ragged and shallow. I threw open the door, slamming it behind me as I scrambled to lock it. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing, the sound of my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't know if I was shaking from the cold or from fear, but it didn't matter. I had made it. I called the police as soon as I could gather myself, telling them everything I had experienced. They asked me if I'd gotten a good look at the person, but I hadn't. I hadn't seen their face, not really. Only shadows. Only that twisted grin that still haunts me. The police said they'd send someone to check the area, but I knew it was useless. There were no witnesses, no evidence. The stranger had disappeared, as though they had never been there at all. The officers left without a word of comfort, and I was left alone with the feeling that something was off. Something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. Waiting for me to walk those same streets again. Now every time I leave my apartment, I take a different route. Every time I step outside, I check over my shoulder. I haven't seen that figure since, but I know they're still out there. I can feel it. I don't know what they wanted, or why they followed me that night. But I can't forget the look in their eyes. The smile. It was something twisted. Something that didn't belong in this world.